After 7 years of complex research, an informer suddenly got in touch with our film team and said he wants to hand over certain documents. Secret documents kept under lock and key at Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, the BND. The BND got a shipping company to transport arms to crisis regions. Our informer knew this, but he kept quiet, and today those regions are war zones. We have arranged to meet at a remote location. Our contact thought mailing the documents to us seemed too risky, even now, 10 years on. We are given the shipping company stowage plans for arms transports. The documents also include photos of tanks in a ship's hold. Tanks for a brutal military dictatorship, supplied despite an embargo. We are also given the freight papers of other ships and finally a computer stick, and that is it. The stowage document shows how 80 tanks have to be positioned in order to get all of them on board. The shipping company's plan: to deliver a consignment of tanks to Islamic North Sudan. The documents also include a manifest: tanks, guns, and ammunition for delivery to Kenya. But the arms were ordered by GOS, the government of South Sudan. Controlled by rebels at the time, South Sudan was in the process of separating from Sudan. The military junta in Myanmar was also supplied with tanks, seen here in a ship's hold. The shipping company which delivered the arms is said to be Beluga, owned by Niels Stolberg. Stolberg agreed to an interview. He wanted to present a different image from other ship owners, seen as someone who staged fundraising concerts, supported social projects, and dreamt of ecological ship propulsion technology. So how can that be reconciled with transporting arms? We confronted Stolberg. Arms to South Sudan and Myanmar? Doesn't that embarrass you?
I personally am very sorry if we carried freight that should not have been carried. There's no question of that.
But you did.
Yes, we chartered ships out and had no idea that certain goods were on board and were transported to highly sensitive regions. We were unaware of that.
Stolberg, the award-winning entrepreneur and self-styled world market leader. Captivated by his success, banks financed the construction of his ships in China, one after another until he had a fleet of 80 vessels. His headquarters in Bremen, northern Germany. The architecture is representative, the location maritime. Stolberg laid the emphasis on size, but then came the shipping crisis. Stolberg earned less and less with his ships. The rising losses were hidden in his balance sheets, but it was all to no avail. After all, the entire world market was collapsing. Under such circumstances, lucrative arms transports were the perfect solution. Stolberg Shipping Company charged $1,094,687 for 2 consignments of tanks to Myanmar. Another lucrative deal involved the Beluga Endurance. The vessel transported tanks, ammunition and guns from Oktyabrsk in the Ukrain to Mombasa in Kenya. The arms were then taken on towards South Sudan by Kenyan railways. Kenya, 2008. New tanks being transported through the country by rail. In Mombasa, several ships have unloaded arms of this kind, not only the Beluga Endurance. Under the gaze of the Kenyan military, a ship carrying weapons berths. This time, it is a Ukrainian vessel. A soldier and an expert sent specially from the Ukraine watch as the cargo hatch opens. Some of the crew have left the ship and look on. Guarded by soldiers, the heavy cargo is unloaded. Yet another consignment for GOS, the rebels in South Sudan. Loaded like other vessels before it in the Ukraine. Now everything has arrived. The President of the Ukraine has sent the head of his foreign intelligence service to hand over a present. The message: our weapons are for you Kenyans, not the South Sudan, even though we know that they were ordered by Goss. The head of the Secret Service is uneasy during the ceremony. Later he told us that his president did not have the arms trade under control and that German ships also secretly loaded weapons in the Ukraine. We're on our way to Oktyabrsk, the name of a secret port and a kind of arms bazaar where, until 2014, Russian and Ukrainian state-run companies offered weapons for export. The port lies hidden some 100 kilometers east of Odessa. It took us a long time to find it. The place was not marked on any map. The Beluga Endurance loaded arms in Oktyabrsk, as did the Beluga Eternity. These photos of the hold on the Beluga Eternity, which were taken secretly, are some of the documents that were leaked to us. Long before the ship with the weapons set out, a certain Klaus Hollmann sent an email to the shipping company. Good morning. What's the situation with the sensitive transport? The key word is sensitive, because there is an EU embargo in place with regard to Myanmar and its dictatorial government. Despite this, the shipping company planned to send a consignment of arms there. In another email, Hollmann made the shipping company a job offer. Tanks for Yemen, a country where a civil war is now raging. His exact words to the director responsible for chartering out the firm's vessels were, "Yemen is currently procuring a large number of tanks. That should be of interest to you. Regards, Klaus Hollmann." The shipping company CEO remembers.
Mr. Hollmann was on the staff of the Federal Intelligence Service. He simply said how things were to be handled and how not.
But it was a sensitive cargo.
It was a sensitive consignment. I reckon that he came to see us maybe once every 2 or 3 months and simply told us how things were to be handled and how not. In other words, it was important for us to proceed according to certain regulations and not to engage in any illegal transport.
So basically he or the BND decided what was on and what wasn't.
Exactly.
This is how the system worked. Hollmann maintained contact with the Beluga Shipping Company for the BND. When the company planned an arms transport, it asked Hollmann whether he saw a problem. If he didn't, Stolberg gave the go-ahead and the ship sailed. For example, a vessel was supposed to take a consignment of tanks, rockets and ammunition to the Congo. The plan was to load the arms in the secret Ukrainian port of Oktyabrsk. The arms cargo was coordinated by the shipping company's chartering director. He wrote to Niels Stolberg, saying that he had sorted everything with regard to the Congo consignment. The ship, he said, could sail. He had, of course, been in touch with Hollmann from the BND and been told that there was no problem. Referring to Hollmann from the BND, who didn't see any problem, the manager asked his boss for his okay. Stolberg wrote back okay, and the ship sailed. Oktyabrsk, the secret port. Stored here were tanks, missiles, guns, and even field kitchens. Everything required for a regional war, and observed by C4ADS, an organization from Washington. Its director is a lieutenant colonel who speaks Russian and Arabic, and was trained at West Point Military Academy. Prior to our interview, the researcher on the left brought the director up to speed on Oktyabrsk. C4ADS had focused on the port because of its arms turnover, and according to David Johnson, it wasn't easy to research. Indeed, the port lies hidden and is hard to access.
You could certainly see it with satellite imagery, but it was not a port that was readily, easily accessed. They had gate guards. There were few roads leading into it. It was out in a restricted area, farther away from the city, out in the countryside to a certain extent on that point on the Bug River. It certainly had gates and controls.
We made our first attempt to see the port in 2013. This is just the first of 3 guarded gates. We weren't allowed any further. Seamen had described to us what it used to look like in the port when they were there to load their ships. Behind the ships, they said, there were arms as far as you could see, and hanging from the cranes were tanks.
The shipments are global. This is going around to countries where there are lots of conflict going on. Eritrea, you're looking at Latin America, Venezuela, you're looking at places in Asia. You're looking at places further south in Africa, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the South Sudan.
5 years later, we're back. And this time we're allowed in. Congo, Kenya, Sudan, Myanmar, and Yemen. Whenever Beluga planned an arms transport, this port was always involved. Secret Service boss Malamush had promised to ring up those in charge of the port. Perhaps that is why we were allowed to simply drive through. In fact, we were even given a musical reception. The port bosses welcomed us. On the left, the Director of Security, the Grey Eminence. On the right, the Union Leader, a kind of Labour Director, and in the middle, a watchdog. First, we were served tea. Then we engaged in small talk. The press spokesperson explained the regulations we would have to observe afterwards in the port. Then the Labour Director indicated that it was time to get going. As he still had things to do, he wouldn't be accompanying us. So the Security Director became our guide. At first, it wasn't quite clear whether we would be able to film from our vehicle. The situation was tense. After all, we were the first television team ever to pitch up here with a camera. This is where we stop, the Director of Security said. Then he issued clear instructions. You can't shoot anything you want. That's okay in this direction, but not in the other direction where the underground warehouses are located. Not even afterwards with the drone. Only in this direction.
Okay.
So it's a secret port.
Это секретный порт.
Относительно.
Yeah, you can say so, not exactly, but
Потому что мы
partly.
перерабатываем
To a certain extent, we load commercial goods and sometimes special goods, chemicals or explosive materials.
химические, вредные, разрядные, взрывчатые материалы.
What about arms, the interpreter asks.
Those too.
The cargo with military, yes.
For the time being, the days of the big arms business are over, because Russian tanks are no longer loaded here. But up until 2014, David Johnson told us Norwegian, Ukrainian, Russian, Danish and German vessels used to put in here. At the jetty where the port people have moored a lovely grain carrier for us, German shipping companies used to berth, including 2 from the Bremen area.
So the ones in the report that we identified were Brisa, as well as a Beluga, which I believe is no longer solvent, because they have special skills that are required. Now, in particular, the German shipping companies that we looked into while we were working on this report were capable of moving heavy cargo. They were specialized ships that had cranes. And usually you want that kind of ship if you're going to a port destination where they may not have the cranes to unload the heavy cargo.
A tank weighs 40 tons. In addition to tanks, the powerful cranes in Oktyabrsk also heaved missile launchers and heavy ammunition boxes on board. Moored to the jetty are the Beluga Endurance, which will be taking arms to Kenya, and the Beluga Eternity, which, despite an EU embargo, will be transporting arms to Myanmar. The Beluga Eternity will be stopping in Bremen for a few hours. Shipping company CEO Niels Stolberg is paying a brief visit. He likes to be seen with his people. Immediately afterwards, the ship set sail for the Ukrainian port of Oktyabrsk with arms for Myanmar on board. Following an initial consignment in 2007, the generals will be getting more tanks, ammunition and guns brought by the Beluga Eternity. With Holman, the BND is firmly in place at Beluga, and not only with regard to Myanmar. When the shipping company planned to transport tanks destined for North Sudan, Holman was well informed. But hadn't the company just transported tanks to Kenya? Tanks whose recipient, according to the manifest, was GOS, the rebels in South Sudan? Didn't Holman know what GOS stood for? Didn't he see a link between the transports for South Sudan and the tanks brought by the Beluga vessel and the tanks for GOS brought by other ships? In 2014, civil war broke out in the fledgling state of South Sudan, a conflict in which there was no shortage of weapons, something we'd like to have discussed with Holman. Brussels is home to an eyewitness who saw the tanks for GOS in South Sudan. He was in the country on behalf of the Bonn International Center for Conversion, a peace research institute. Luc van der Vondervoort met members of the South Sudan military. These are pictures of his visit. Shortly before the civil war erupted and 5 years after the ships brought the arms, he inspected a small arms store which we see here. As it happens, the general showed him something really grand.
The first time I specifically remember seeing these T-72s was at the SPLA main headquarters around Bilpam, because they were just stationed there as to guard the compound. I think that's a particularly effective way of guarding your compound, but the general himself said, "Do you want us to drive around?" So it felt really bizarre, almost like they were showing them off to us. Look at the kind of stuff that we have here. Look at how we can drive them around and show you how impressive our... Yeah, they were incredibly proud. And I remember saying to my colleague, "Is this a good idea?" Because those were the tanks that they were not supposed to have. But apparently the SPLA itself thought it was no problem.
According to a secret dispatch from the US government, the American Secret Service has satellite pictures proving that tanks were delivered to GOS in South Sudan. The cargo documents for the Beluga Endurance show tanks, field howitzers and machine guns ordered by GOS. Niels Stolberg dismisses any involvement.
We knew nothing about that.
But Stolberg's people did plan arms transports, and not only for North Sudan. And Stolberg gave his okay for arms consignments for the Congo. Then came the job offer. Keyword: Yemen. Mombasa, Kenya. Ships have a direct link to the rail system. This ship is being unloaded by Ukrainian technicians. The tanks transported here for GOS will continue their onward journey straight away. South Sudan in 2014. Its president, Salva Kiir, the man with the hat, was armed to the teeth and waged war. Not on Islamic North Sudan, as many had predicted, but on his former fellow fighters in the rebel war. On the young republic's vice president, Riek Machar, and he mobilized his forces against the president. Today, there are Kalashnikovs galore in South Sudan, and even more powerful weapons. Now, each side can really stick it to the other.
We didn't know that.
The Beluga Endurance transported tanks to Kenya. It cannot be proved that the shipping company knew that the client hiding behind the name GOS was South Sudan. The consignment of tanks for North Sudan was transported by another shipping company.